Hello gamers and welcome back. I'm Rob, of course, or Warshack if you want to call me by my in-game name, and I'm going to be going over the top 5 budget-based aggro decks you guys can build. Keep in mind that all the decks I'm going to go over are, I believe, below 2,500 dust, a lot of them being even below 1,500 dust in total to craft. On top of that, there'll be no adventure mode cards, and there will be no epics or legendaries in any of these decks, making it so it's, again, very affordable for the free-to-play and budget-based players wanting to build semi-decent decks, and also while they're building the decks be able to craft cards that are found in, higher deck or higher value decks, because it's always a shame that you like craft 2 or 3 cards that are quite expensive, and then you find out that those cards aren't actually useful in any other decks besides that one. So the good news is a lot of these decks that I built utilize a lot of cards that are seen in among a variety of different decks, not just the deck that we're looking at here. So the first deck we're going to cover is going to be the Hunter deck. This is more of a sort of mid-range aggro hunter. Unfortunately, it is missing some of the cards like Kindly Grandmother and some of the oomph it has in the early game due to the fact that, again, we are leaving out adventure mode cards, as you do have to purchase that, and they can be quite expensive. And the fact that, Call of the Wild is also an epic card. But basically what this deck is trying to do is start off very strong in the early game with having a reasonable amount of 1-drop, so you can at least have a 1 or a 2-drop guaranteed. From there, moving into the middle of the game, we have cards like Animal Companion, Deadly Shot, and Eagle Horn Bow to be able to kind of pick up what the early game is bringing on. From there, we want to basically buff our minions or deal face damage with cards like Kill Commander, Houndmaster, and then follow up the game with the Savannah Highmane. Normally, the rule of thumb is if your Savannah Highmane attacks your opponent directly in the face, you basically will win that game, because by turn 6 you've dealt a sizable amount of damage with the earlier cards. Savannah Highmane's hitting them for 6 in the dome. If they happen to kill Savannah Highmane, it's going to pop out 2 2/2s, and those are going to hit them in the dome. Plus, of course, you have your Rexar hero power. Keep in mind, as your collection gets larger, you'll be able to add more and more cards to any of these budget deck lists that we go over. So it's like a lot of questions I get is, hey Rob, I got the Rexar Death Knight, does it fit in this deck? Of course it can. You can fit, let's say you get, a really good card that you can fit, that you're like, oh man, I'm running, for example, Warrior, and I don't have Brawl in the deck because it's an epic, and you happen to get Brawl. Should I put Brawl in? Of course. You just acquired a card that is much better than the cards that I have, but again, these are budget decks. So just keep in mind that there's going to be numerous replacements over the course of your Hearthstone career while obtaining cards. So just keep in mind, that you can, in fact, replace these cards with better cards once you get them. Which cards do you replace exactly? It's hard to say because I'm not really sure what card you obtained. But overall, just try to make your best judgment call on that. Again, Hunter, a very fast-paced deck. I mean, in total, this deck costs 1,300 dust. That's not a lot. Can this deck get you to rank 10? I think it can. I've tested a few of these decks out. A buddy of mine, I can't think of the name off the top of my head, but he also helped me create a lot of these decks that we're going to be going over, and actually he tested them himself and found a lot of success. I've modified them a little bit based on what I think, but overall, if I can, by the end of the video or the start of the next video, I can catch his name. Lord of Wolves, I believe it is. Yep, Lord of Wolves, got it. So shout out to him for helping me out, helping me build these decks and testing them. But either way, good deck. In my opinion, Hunter's one of the easier decks to play in regards to decisions per turn to make. You have some other decks that are more of the control oriented or mid-range. You could possibly have anywhere between 3 to 5, 6 possible plays in a single turn. Hunter normally has max 1 to 2, possibly 3 if we're feeling frisky. But normally Hunter is like one of the least decision oriented decks. Moving to the next budget deck, we have the sort of tempo mage. Even like we can call it a secret tempo mage, but either or, it's going to fall into the same category of, again, playing early statted minions that are basically very powerful for their mana cost, that either have an ability that reduces your spells in your hand by 1, like Sorcerer's Apprentice, or increasing the damage output of your spells by 1, which we have, of course, the I believe Cold Sorcerer. From there, we start off very strong Mana Worm. Normally, this isn't like a turn 1 deck. I mean, Mana Worm on 1 is pretty powerful, but you could play Mana Worm anytime in this deck, regardless of it being turn 1, 4, 5, 6. It's still a card that, if unchecked, can, it grows every time you play a spell. There's a lot of spells in the deck. Bada bing, bada boom, Mana Worm needs to be dealt with. From there, Turn 2 is going to be one of your most important turns. You definitely always want to have at least Mana Worm, Arcanologist, Sorcerer, or Sorcerer's Apprentice coming down on that turn 2. If not, use Frostbolt to remove what your opponent has played. If, you know, it's good enough to be, you don't want to Frostbolt to 1-1. But just keep in mind, turn 2 in this deck is very important. Followed by that, turn 3 is another spike turn where you're either going to be playing cards like Arcane Intellect, or more importantly, and even more powerful, is the Kirin Mage, followed by a Secret. If you can start off with the Mana Worm, like let's say a 2-drop and then Kirin Tor into a Secret, normally those are the games that you win. That's just a very, very intense and very strong opener. Again, this deck is coming in at below 1400 dust for the entirety of it. A lot of the things I see, because we've had budget decks before, we have Firelands Portal in here, and people will be like, hey, Rob, Firelands Portal is not a free card. It actually comes, it's part of an adventure mode. It is part of the adventure mode, but the part of adventure mode that it's from is free. So you just have to do the pre-log of, I believe, Karazhan, and you actually get Firelands Portal for free. So granted, it is an adventure mode card, but you get it for free. So I'm not really counting that the card is still free. You know what I'm saying? From there, it starts, it depends on secrets very heavily, so make sure, you know, you have a reason to play your entity, mana bond, and counterspell. You don't want to, like, kind of juke yourself out, play the wrong one, your opponent plays a Doomsayer, and you've lost all of your early game tempo. From there, the late game consists of Faceless Summoner, Cabal Runner, and your Firelands Portal. Again, this deck isn't really supposed to go in the late game, because we don't have Frostlich Jaina, as she is a legendary card, budget-based decks. So if you happen to get Frostlich Jaina, then you can replace a card like a Faceless Summoner, and all of a sudden your deck has the ability to make it into the late game. So again, very decent tempo mage in my opinion, very powerful deck, and again, could probably get you pretty far on ladder if used correctly. So heading on over to Druid, we have the aggro / token Druid. This is a used to be a really, really popular deck. Now most of the time we see some form of like Jade and or ramp Druid in there, but I believe this is still a pretty powerful deck. Granted, this doesn't actually have living mana in it due to the fact that living mana again is an epic card. So if you're interested in playing aggro Druid, that's one of the cards I recommend almost first to grab to make this deck a lot better. But this deck actually runs a little bit different than the tempo mage and the hunter that we had gone over, because both of the hunter and the mage have the ability to use spells to be able to do a sizable and decent amount of damage to your opponent directly, whether it's Frostbolt, Fireball, Firelands Portal from the mage, or Kill Command Hero Power from the hunter. This deck doesn't actually have a lot of reach in regards to spells. It does have the swipe, but most of the time this deck is a very Curvestone-esque deck. And what I mean by that is the ability to play a minion almost every single turn, or multiple minions per turn. So in this deck, you're definitely looking to curve out, getting your 1-drops, 2-drops, 3-drops, 4-drops, playing them, you know, as you see fit, and filling out the curve appropriately. Most of the time, this deck is able to kind of swarm your opponent. From there, you're able to buff the board with cards like Mark of the Wild, not Mark of the Wild, Power of the Wild, Mark of Yasharj, and Mark of the Lotus, and they kind of turn your little minions into medium-sized minions, which is really hard for a lot of these control decks to be able to deal with prior to turn 5 or 6, when their AoE normally wraps around. If we look at Priests, they have Dragonfire Potion on 6, Warriors have Brawl on 5, but sometimes you actually can just wrap up the game prior to turn 6 with cards like Savage Roar, in combination with the buffs that you've acquired earlier in the game. Some flaws to this deck is it does not have any card draw whatsoever. So when you run out of cards in your hand with this deck, you've thrown up on the board, you've given it all you've got, and if your opponent has a board clear, normally you lose. That's where cards like Living Mana, like I mentioned before, come into play, because it actually fills your board up with creatures based on your mana. So it actually compensates the card draw very, very well. Or should I say compensates the lack of card draw very well. But either or, we've replaced that with cards like Soul of the Forest, which actually, when when a card dies, it'll resummon 2/2 in its place to kind of help you keep the board even though they're killing creatures. Unfortunately, the card is nowhere near as good as Living Mana, but it is what we got, and this is a budget-based deck. We were actually running a very similar list on our free-to-play account, which has proven to be pretty successful, surprisingly, and definitely can destroy people on ladder. Again, the Galaka Crawler is then for tech, the Crazed Alchemist is for tech, and the Spellbreaker's for tech. You also can go ahead and put Bone Mares in this deck if you feel like it, instead of, like, let's say Druid of the Claw, or let's say you don't like Crazed Alchemist and Spellbreaker, you can just replace those with Bone Marrow. So these decks are still free for you to, you know, mess with and kind of put in what you think might be a little bit better, but this is kind of just the foundation for you to build off of. I don't want you guys to think that you have to copy pasta these exact deck lists, because depending on your rank, depending on the cards you have, and depending on your play style, you know, you can definitely change up a few things and it may actually work better for you. Moving to the next deck is going to be one of the more expensive ones, the 1700 Dust deck. It's so crazy because if you look at these budget-based decks and then look at some of these, like, you know, Kazakis or Raza Priest decks that are somewhere in the 14,000 Dust range to craft, it's just like a substantial difference. Like 1700 Dust, 14,000 Dust. You know what I mean? Like, this is such a big bump. So with this, we have the Murloc Paladin. It's one of the more aggressive ones because it runs Divine Favor and a lot of one-drops. So in this particular deck, very similar to the Druid deck, you're going to want to play all of your minions as fast as possible. But in replace of the Druid not having card draw, in this deck you actually have card draw based on your opponent. So Divine Favor says, you know, draw as many cards in your opponent's hand. You have a lot of one drops, so you go one drop, one drop, one drop, you know, 2 drop, 3 drop. By turn 4 or 5, you have no cards in your hand. You play Divine Favor, your opponent has 5 or 6. You draw 5 or 6 cards for 3 mana, you're back in the game, and you also have a board full of minion. This deck, unlike the Druid, they both revolve around having minions on the board, which is one of the most important things to both decks. But the Druid has a style of spell that actually buffs the entire board and all of your minions. Meanwhile, Paladin is more single target buffs with cards like Blessings of the King and the Spike Ridge Seed. So instead of buffing the entire board, you're buffing singular minions. And then you also have the Murloc Synergy in the deck, which means you're actually buffing individual Murlocs or field full of Murlocs with cards like Cold Light Seer. Again, Gentle Megasaur is really, really good in this deck because it buffs Murlocs, but again, it's an epic card, so if you happen to get, you know, Gentle Megasaur, you're more than welcome to put it in the deck and replace it with, you know, the Spellbreakers or the Argent Squires and things like that. So just keep in mind, there are better cards to put in these decks. I'm well aware what these, I love when people are like, Rob, why don't you have this in the deck? It's just like, because these are budget decks, and I'm not including epics and legendaries in them because not everybody has them. I'm well aware of how to build a tier 1 Murloc Paladin list with all the cards, or the cards, whistles, and bells, but that doesn't actually help the players who can't afford them. So that's, again, please don't hit me up with the Rob, why didn't you add this? It's because it's probably an epic or a legendary, or maybe even an adventure mode card. Unless, if it's not one of those and you think it should be in the deck, you're more than welcome to mention it in the comment section below. I'm not trying to, you know, sway you from not leaving your feedback. Just if your feedback contains, hey Rob, why is there not, you know, Tyrion? I'm just gonna kind of shake my head and be like, yeah, you're that guy. The next deck is going to be the aggro Shaman, or some like to call it the Evolved Shaman. I call it the Pokemon Shaman. Granted, the entirety of the deck revolves around you evolving minions, but I've actually toned it a little bit to a different side of the fence, because we can't actually have Doppelganger, which is normally a very key ingredient in the Evolved Shaman, Pokemon Shaman, or again the aggro Shaman. All of which are the same deck we're talking about. We've actually included the Jade package. So we have like cards like Jade Spirit to kind of fill in that flex spot. We've got Galaka Crawlers to be able to kind of counter the meta. There's a lot of pirates running around. So this deck, again, not really as powerful as the true, you know, Doppelgangster Evolve Shaman, but still, I think it has definitely an edge on it, and it can definitely perform just as well as all of the other decks that we have covered. Again, this may not have burst from hand through spells. It actually has burst through minions on board. So you're not necessarily like the Druid, you're buffing your board, Paladin, you're buffing individual minions, and Shaman, you're filling up your board with many minions, just like the other two decks, but instead of buffing them singularly or AoE style, you're actually buffing them in a sense of increasing their attack by +3 with cards like Bloodlust, and smacking your opponent in the face with, let's say, 4 or 5 cheap minions. You're pushing, you know, anywhere between 10 to 15 damage through just Bloodlust alone, whatever their attacks are plus that, and you're able to most of the time easily push anywhere between 15 to 25 damage in a single turn with Bloodlust in combination with, you know, your weapon or Jade Lightning, or again, just the cards you have on the board. So this deck, again, really, really powerful. It punishes slow decks and any deck that really doesn't run early game taunts or early game removal, which there's actually a lot of that running around. There's a lot of players that think they can get around, you know, I'm going to build the most greedy priest deck and it's going to destroy the meta. Well, you know, you're going to get wrecked by the players playing aggro to put you guys back in check. That's always my favorite thing, is to come across someone who's playing a deck solely to defeat only one deck, but they lose versus everything else. And decks like this are the perfect example of how you destroy those players who think they're next level. So with that, this is, again, one of the more expensive decks, with it costing 2,100. So again, you can build any of these decks. They'll all provide you with a, a sizable amount of wins, good experience, and overall a good foundation to what these decks, you're building the foundation of these decks, and then you work your way towards, upgrading them to the point where they're, at their max state or max capacity, where you have like all of the good cards in the deck. But the good news is you're not crafting cards that either you don't need or you're not going to use in the future, which is kind of what I want to aim for you to do. I want you to craft cards that you can use and they're not going to become unuseful for a good period while after creating the deck. So with that, if you've enjoyed, let me know in the comment section below if I happen to miss anything that you think that is really important. Feel free to leave that as well, as this is an educational video for the players looking to build themselves, the start to their tier 1, tier 2 decks, so they can do fairly well on ladders. So with that, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next budget deck video. And as always, I'm Robert Warshack, and happy whatever the hell day it is.